So what is sapience? The old idea was that mind and thought represented the world. But if that was so, then the mind is going to be separate from the world. What I'm saying is that sapience, which is our ability to reflect and control ourselves, results from the fact that we have two representational systems, imagination and language, each able to reflect and control the other. So what in the state of nature is representation? The problem here, you see, is that most philosophers have concluded that representation isn't natural, that it depends on human minds. And you can see their point. Like, I have a ring here, an Ethiopian ring with tally marks and little symbol-like squiggles on it. Now, I don't know whether they are just decoration or put there to impress by some illiterate person, or whether they actually mean something. And whether they are representations or accidental marks is not a property of the ring itself. It's a property of the person who made the ring 100 years ago and in Africa. Representation isn't in the object. For example, if you have a cut tree with growth rings, are they a representation of the age of the tree? For us, they might be, but not for the tree. It's our interpretation that makes them a representation. So the conclusion is representation depends on conscious minds. But I want to argue that that is in fact not the case. Back in 1941, a theorist called von Neumann asked the question, how is it possible to have a self-reproducing system? How can a system make copies of itself, the way organisms do? What's the mechanism behind this? You can copy things simply with a copy machine. You make a negative, you make a positive from the negative, and you're back to something very much like the beginning, duplication, simple. But what he was talking about was to make a whole copy machine that copies itself. And that's much trickier. How could you make a robot that was able to make copies of itself? I mean, suppose you had a robot with a built-in plan or program for making robots like itself. If that was so, then the built-in plan or program would have to include a picture or a plan of the plan itself, because the new robot would need that. And the same with that one. And you would get an infinite continuation of plans within plans. Clearly that won't work. Well, perhaps not so clearly. I mean, back in the 19th century, some people believed in just that. They believed that the human sperm contained a little tiny human being, and that in each human of those tiny human beings there would be even tinier sperm, and so on. And that Adam in the Garden of Eden had within him all possible future human beings, preformed, one within the other, until the day of judgment. I mean, even God couldn't do that. Not if he wanted atoms in his universe, anyway. No, that's nonsense. The simple solution is that you have the map and or the plan and the robot separate. The robot uses the plan to make a new robot, then he duplicates the plan with an old-fashioned copy machine and gives a copy of the plan to the new robot. In other words, self-reproducing systems have to be in two separate parts. One part is a representation of the other. And this seems to be a universal principle. As shown, 10 years later, after von Neumann, they discovered DNA. And it works in just that way. The body is far too complicated to be directly copied, but it's all built up from DNA, which is our blueprint, our inner plan, which can be copied directly. So it seems that representation is a completely natural thing. In fact, we can have a sort of definition of it. We can define a representation as that part of a self-reproducing system that regenerates those parts that are unable to replicate themselves. It's simpler if you write it as a little formula, but it's obvious enough, really. DNA is, after all, rather like human writing. Human speech can't be easily replicated, but human writing, which is produced from it by a simple code, can be written and stored and sent and treated in all sorts of ways, and you can recover the speech from it. The logical form of like speech and writing, DNA and protein, is basically the same, as described by von Neumann. Another natural example would be the language of bees. Bees go out flying on journeys, bring back honey, but it's not possible for another bee to directly copy it. So what they do is that they have a little dance which they can perform in the hive, and which another bee can read and effectively replicate the message, and then go off on a journey which had been represented by the dance. Same principle. And I would say that it could well be that our human ancestors, who were after all also hunter-gatherers, could have made very good use of a symbolic representational system for saying where things were. And I suspect the first properly representational language did in fact do the same sort of job that the waggle dance does for the bees. So the whole world of biological organisms, the biosphere, is a self-reproducing system, or a system of systems, all of which depend on DNA representation to keep them going. Now, what I want to say is that the whole system of human culture and human thought, the noosphere, is also a self-reproducing system, and a self-representing, or a self-reproducing system that depends on representation in the same way that the biosphere is. I mean, it's a more complicated example because it's clear that our culture contains many representational systems. But in fact, basically, it all comes down in the end to the kind of von Neumann system that we've seen in the other natural examples. They can be multiplied and combined and reflected, but the basic formula is the same for all of them. And in real life, it corresponds to the human ability to understand and imitate and represent other people. We are born able to represent other human beings, and that is what the whole system is built up on. And I'll talk about how that came about in my next talk.